Greetings and welcome. Thank you to each and every listener for joining me today for my podcast on What Brings You In. My name is Bradley Wenk, and I am an aspiring mental health counselor here to promote mental health awareness, discuss mental health topics, and spread some positive energy. If this is your first time joining us, thank you so much for being here today. I hope there is something in this podcast for you to take away and graciously impact your day to day. If you are a returning listener, thank you for tuning in to this brand new episode titled Beyond the Rainbow: What It Means to Be Out and Proud. Today, we are going to be talking about mental health topics, issues, and discussions among the LGBTQ plus communities. There are so many conversations to be had on this subject, and I am joined today by two allies. The first is Belcher, who works as a data systems manager for a healthcare company where he assesses and analyzes the data of patients suffering from post-traumatic brain injuries. Within our local queer community, LD is also a semi-retired drag queen who has boasted his talents and taken the stage by storm as the fabulous Jayden LaRaye. Both LD and Jayden LaRaye are celebrated and respected staples within our community, and I am so happy to have you here.
Thank you
If
for
you
having
have,
me.
Thank you. If you have listened to this podcast before, you may recognize Christina Baker, who joined me for a past episode. Christina gave such a raw and beautiful interview, and while we were talking, I noticed there were some connections between her journey and some of the factors we tend to find among members of the LGBTQ plus communities. We have all gathered here today at the CoLab Studios here in Clearwater, Florida, where Christina works as the owner and operator. Welcome, you two. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor, and I'm grateful to be on show number 2.
Here we go. As always, before we get started, the views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely the views of the individuals involved and by no means represent absolute facts. Opinions expressed by the host and guests can change at any time. At times, this podcast may cover sensitive topics, and we ask you refrain from listening if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, the producer, the host, nor the guest shall at any time be liable for the content covered causing offense, distress, or any other reaction. I am not a licensed mental counselor, and this podcast should not be used to substitute for actual mental health support. All right. So, there's a couple different ways I wanted to approach this episode, having the two of you here today. And I think one of the first things we can dive into is that we know the statistics are there among the members of our communities, being gay, queer, lesbian, bisexual, however you do fall into the category, and mental health. And I think one of the first things we do consider is there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of guilt that is associated with it. And throughout this episode, I think we're really going to dive into our own individual experiences with how we've transitioned into who we are as people, as strong, beautiful people, I should say, but also some of our struggles and just talking about it. And this podcast it's funny, I'm being very transparent with this podcast. It did not start out exactly the way I thought it was going to. It kind of all comes into its own entity, if you will. And all of a sudden, what I thought I was going to be focusing on, it turns out I'm really focusing on the stigma. And instead of bringing professionals on here who I could just talk to, or turning this into a podcast where we might say it was like an actual therapy session, this is actually just really talking about real people in the community who may or may not fall into these categories, who have a lot of perspective to give. So that's why I wanted to have both of you here today.
I love it. It's a
Yeah.
great concept. And certainly, doing my own podcasts, I have noticed that same element of you start out one way and it goes in a total different direction. It's
Hmm.
really magical
Yeah.
how it works, and if you let it flow and just roll with it, some excellent information and very helpful information can come from that.
Right. And it's kind of the universe's way of saying, hey, this is maybe the way you should have taken this
Hmm.
to begin with. But it is. And that's why I'm really happy to have you guys here. And I'm glad too. It's kind of fun. I was kind of, again, in transparency, when you do these podcasts, we've been recording them out of order, if you will, like a movie. Sometimes you'd record one of the later scenes before you do the opening scene.
Mm.
And I've learned so much just from that. So having you guys here today is definitely part of, I think it happened this way for a reason.
Great.
So in the sense of knowing that we don't know who's listening to this or who our audience is exactly, I know both of you and we all know each other a little bit, but I think I wanted to start this by each of us kind of taking a second and talking briefly kind of about our coming out story, or our experience. Just like I said, we're going to dive into a little bit more, but just if you could give like a little brief intro of
Mhm.
yourself and what it means to be gay, I guess. Would
Mm.
be a good way to say it. So, ladies first.
Oh, ladies first. All right. Well, I think my story is probably not super unique, but I think there are some unique aspects that run along with it. I was born here in Clearwater into a family who's very involved in the Southern Baptist church community, and that is how I was raised.
Mm.
And I was very much a tomboy, if we want to call it that. I don't know if that's politically correct,
I mean,
but I certainly was.
yeah. Yeah.
So I was very athletic. I had mom and a dad, a very traditional family. We went to church 3 times a week. That was very much a part of my upbringing. And when I graduated from high school, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do and didn't have a whole lot of direction from my parents. And so I thought, I need to get married.
Mm.
Oh,
So
wow.
I got married to a great guy, and we had 2 kids. We have 2 boys, and I was 20 when we got married. And so we were great friends and had 2 kids together. And in my late 20s, I started noticing that I was having some different feelings, and I had never been exposed to the gay community. I did not have one gay friend, and I'm in my late 20s, and I started having dreams about women, and I'm like, this is so bizarre. I talked to my doctor, like, what is going on? I went to therapy, of course, Christian therapist from my church, and
Right.
he was
They
like,
follow the script, and you were living the script. I've seen that script over and over
That's why I say
again.
it's not unique. So my therapist was like, you're not responsible for your dream world. And I'm like, great. Okay. So I don't have to feel guilty about this, but what is this? And so this went on and on and on. And I actually told my husband at that time about it. And he was like, all right, I get it. He was very understanding. And so I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was pray for God to alleviate these, quote, sinful feelings in myself. And for several years, this went on. So then I thought I had this great idea of I'm just going to find somebody that I can try this out on, and then I'll get it out of my system and
Mhm.
I'll go back to my husband and everything will be fine. So what do I do again? I pray. God, please just send me somebody safe. Like, just send me somebody safe. I'm going to knock this out, be done, and
Mhm.
I'll never have to think about it again. So, about a month later, this person came into my life and I shared with her my feelings. And this was a very safe, trusted person for me that I had known most of my life. And she was like, yeah, I'm down. So, again, no gay friends, no gay community,
Wow.
no,
That is
like,
interesting.
never seen like porn. Like, I have no clue what being a lesbian is. I just had this huge draw towards
Mhm.
being in the comfort of a woman.
Mhm.
So that one didn't really answer any questions for me. It was weird. It left more questions than answers. So I immediately found another woman
Mhm.
who was closer in age to me, and we had a very big bang connection.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And we were together for about 3 months, and my husband knew about that. And then her husband found out, and that's when it ended.
Mhm.
And that was a very dark period for me because I had all of a sudden found this person, and then all of a sudden she was gone.
Mm.
And so then I got into another relationship with a woman, and this woman was a little bit older than me, very intelligent, and we fought like cats and dogs because she was trying to break me of my religious upbringing. I mean,
Mm.
she was like, there's nothing wrong with you. This is who
Mhm.
you are. And, and I just wouldn't buy it. I was like, nope, you're
Mhm.
wrong. You need to go to church. you know, I'm going to hell because I'm having an affair with a woman and beating myself up over that. So for 2 years, I stayed in that relationship with this woman who she was also married and her husband was aware of us. And I just got to the point where I was so tired of fighting. I had never
Mm.
been in a relationship before where we fought. And I was like, I'm done. I'm out. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm going back to my husband. Like, goodbye.
Mhm.
So that ended. And then 2 weeks later, my middle school best friend reached out to me on Facebook. And so she's like, hey, you want to go grab lunch or whatever? So we did. And I brought pictures before cell phones, like had pictures and stuff on it. So I literally brought like a Ziploc bag full of pictures of my kids. And well, long story short, we figured out that we lived in the same neighborhood.
Mm.
And we had lived in the same neighborhood for 2 years and didn't know it. She was married, had kids. I was, of course, married, had 2 kids. I'm like, this is great. That was a great lunch, whatever. So a few weeks later, she's like, hey, I'm going to go watch the World Series when the Rays was in the World Series. I don't even remember that.
You're asking the wrong
2000,
guy.
I,
I want to say it was like
2008.
around like a 2008,
I think
2010.
2008.
Yeah,
Yeah.
somewhere around there. I
Okay.
remember.
Okay. So we watched that game. We went actually to the Chickaboom room,
Mhm.
watching the game there. And she's like, hey, why don't you wear a wedding ring? And I was like, oh, I just worked out. I put it aside. Again, this was my high school best friend. I just got out of this relationship that was just so tumultuous. And this is not on my radar at all.
Mhm.
So a couple more drinks, she asked me again. She's like, "Yeah, I'm not buying that.
Mhm.
What's going on?" And so I said, "Well, I just got out of a 2-year relationship with a woman, and I'm not wearing my ring right now. Whatever. I'm just kind of in a weird place." And she thought I was kidding. I was not kidding. And then we get in the car to go home, and she totally puts the moves on me. And I'm like, what is going on here? This is my middle school best friend, and I'm not down with this. And so,
You
but I
prayed,
was.
Yeah.
but the prayer turned out to be a little differently, huh?
Yes, it was very different. It was very different. So, that friend and I have now been married
Wow.
for 7 years. We've been together ever since,
Yeah.
basically. And we got married when it was legal. And so that was really not a short story. I know you said to be
Oh,
brief, but
no, I got
I
kind of lost
feel
in that. That was so
It
romantic.
was very no, it's a very
Yeah.
beautiful story, and there's so many similarities to our upbringing
Hmm.
and to kind of my experiences as well. Although my experience didn't have such a happy ending,
Yeah.
we're still looking for that happy ending.
All
But
right, I
we'll
got
find
you.
it eventually.
Right. And
But
just for our
that prayer thing,
listeners, you and I have met a
yes,
couple times,
yeah,
but really have never had
no,
conversation.
not
So
really,
kind
no,
of setting the
nothing,
stage here.
yeah, nothing greatly in detail.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. Go
No,
ahead.
no, no. I didn't want to interrupt your story, but I'm just like listening and thinking, oh my God, yes, we definitely have some similarities,
All right.
especially with the religion and prayer thing.
Right. Well, that's a great inlay, I think, for you.
Okay. Well, so I also grew up Southern Baptist, but I grew up Southern. So it's Southern Missionary
Mm-hmm.
Baptist. So
Understood.
Missionary Baptist is more African American Baptist. So when you throw that in, it's a different situation. Although my parents allowed my brother and I to explore a lot of different churches and a lot of different religions. They were kind of like, we just want you to pick something that you believe in. But I definitely kind of had the same scripted upbringing,
Mm.
which mom, dad both worked, came home, mom cooked dinner every night. We were around the table, which is, I understand, a rare thing that does occur sometimes. I mean, I think it happens more frequently than most people would say within the Black community. But there's these stigmas of, oh well, that's weird, and it's like, no, actually, it's more off. It's more. I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood of families that had dinner every night, but sometimes you listen to what the stereotypes are, and you're
Mm.
like, oh no, not everybody's a single black mom. I had both mom and dad; they were there. But religion was an important thing. We went to church 3 times a week. You
Mm.
had the Sundays, you had the Wednesdays, you had the Saturdays. Um, but they did, at a certain age, allow my brother and I to kind of explore our own religious ideas and go figure it out. You've been here, but I want you to figure it out. Um, which I think kind of backfired on them in a sense. So, as a kid, I didn't really have, I think, any type of desires either way. I was a very, I don't want to say naive, but I was very innocent as a kid.
Hmm.
Um, and that innocence, unfortunately, there was some experiences, abusive, sexually experiences that occurred that kind of took the innocence away. But there was
Mm.
also some compartmentalizing on I think, in my own head as a self of protection.
For
So I
sure.
Mhm.
kind of, yes,
Yes.
absolutely,
Yes.
put some stuff away,
Yes.
boxed it up, and said, that didn't happen.
Right.
Um, which there was still that innocence that was there. So I never really looked at boys or girls. I
Mm.
was just kind of like, there's my friend here, this is my friend here. Become a teenager, things started to change, and I found myself feeling more attracted towards the guys in my class than the girls in my class. But I knew, based upon what we've been taught in church, that's not okay.
Right.
So you're not supposed to act out on those things. You're not supposed to do anything with that. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to be me. I'm not going to talk about it. So I just will be, for the lack of better terms, asexual.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Just no, no,
It's
no,
easier
no.
almost to
Yeah,
be that way
yeah.
than
Mm.
yeah.
So yeah. But as I, got to become an adult, got into high school. I was a very popular kid in high school. Um, no one ever picked on me. No one ever called me gay. No one ever. I never went through those experiences, which I'm fortunate for, and I understand. It's not like that for everybody. But then I started working and going to school, and I had the opportunity to leave. Oh, I should say this: I grew up in a very small town in
Mm.
Central Florida, very rural,
Mm.
very set in its ways. When it comes to sexuality, if you're not straight, there's something wrong with you.
Mm.
And we basically have three races: you're white, you're black, or you're Hispanic.
Hmm.
That's it.
Right.
There's no classification other than you
Yeah.
can't be
Yeah.
Irish. No, you're white. You can't be Greek. No, you're white.
Yeah.
Cuban. Well, they may try to figure out. You
Mm.
might be white or you might be. It all depends on the texture or not the texture, but the color.
Yeah.
The tone of your skin, I should say. But
Right.
when I got to be an adult, I figured, as I got out of Wachula and actually moved here to Clearwater, I saw people living. I saw
Mm.
people living, and they were doing their things, and I was like, okay, I think it's time for me to address this. I think it's time for me to live and try to find a partner. I did say I was going to give it a go with a girl, and I had a
Mhm.
girlfriend for about 4 or 5 months, and just didn't feel right. And
Mhm.
so I had a conversation with my parents about it, and and this is kind of the funny story about my coming out is when I tell my mom and dad that I'm gay, my mom says, well, maybe there's something wrong with your endocrine system.
Oh.
Your sisters have hormone problems, so maybe you do too. And I'm like, oh, okay,
Wow.
okay. So I had just started working over here. I'd been at at the company about 6 months. I had a primary care physician, and I picked him because he had a funny name. But I called him up and I was like, hey, I need to see you. My mom seems to think there might be something happening with my endocrine system. And he's like, okay, you're going to need to come in for this. So I get in his office and I'm sitting in the office with him. And I keep in mind, I want to say this also is I did pray. I prayed to God.
Mm.
I prayed
Mhm.
to whoever was up there to say, if this is my life, give me a
Yeah.
sign. I just need
Mhm.
some kind of sign. I tried to date the girl. I think he kind of
Different.
said, no, that wasn't it, whenever she found certain magazines.
Mm.
Uh, I thought I hit him well.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm seeing the doctor. I'm sitting in there with him and I explain the story to him. And he looks at me and he starts laughing. And I'm like, Doc, this is serious. This is my life. And he said, my mother said the same thing to me.
Oh.
I had no idea that my
No.
doctor was gay
Oh, wow.
at all.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
Oh my
But
gosh.
he was a mentor. a guide
Oh.
into the community.
Oh, that's
And I called my mother right after I got out of his office. I called my mother and I said, I saw my doctor. There's nothing wrong with me.
turns
I
out.
was like, and the cool
Turns
thing
out.
is, he's gay. And she's like, you have a gay doctor. And I was like, I have a gay doctor. I said, but I prayed for it, in a sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
But, my dad, even after telling my dad that story, I kind of came to a grips with religion really quickly after that, because the way that I would look at it is this. One, I don't think God's going to be mad at me for loving someone. Two, I work in a job where I give back. I really take care of people, and I've been doing that for a while.
Right.
So I'm not living a life that is harming anyone. And you can't, how are you going to come at me for loving? But the other thing was, and this is where me and my dad, like I said, you gave me the opportunity to learn a lot of things about religion. So looking at the Old Testament, looking at the New Testament, it's all about forgiveness. So I figured, as long as God knows my heart, and after every sexual act, I say, God, please forgive me, then I'm okay and I can make it to heaven, because I look at my dad, I'm like, well, you wear polyester and all of those things from the Old Testament that y'all do on a
Probably
daily
touch
basis.
a football on Sunday.
Right. I think we're okay. So I'm going to be fine. My father can argue with me. He just said, you know what? Just live your life. I love you. They were so supportive. I love you. Live your life. But it was extended family.
Yeah.
It was people in the community that's who you had to get past. But, coming out wasn't terrible for me, but I wish I had clarity at an earlier age. And I see some of the kids these days that have these realizations even younger.
Right.
And they're able to educate themselves. They're able to access resources that are available that we didn't have. As you speak of your experience, Christina, of the, it was years before that even became something on your radar,
Yeah.
There are 2 points with what you're saying that I want to make sure before this, because there's 3 of us here, so I feel like we can kind of really dive deep into some things. But the one thing with both of your stories, there are, I want to say this, I think there's a point of gratitude as 3 gay people who are sitting here, the forefathers and foremothers who were able to fight and to give us basically, the stigma is still there. The hate is still there. It's always going to be there. But compared to what it is like for some people, or compared to what it has been like for people in the past, we are in a time where you can be safe being in a relationship openly with your wife or with your partner, with your husband, with whatever. And that would not have been possible without the people from the past. So we could not have this podcast without saying thank you for that.
Yes.
And the second part is for anybody who is struggling, or anybody who's listening to this who maybe has that feeling, because I haven't got to my story, but we have a lot of things in common between religion, between the things that you just feel. It is a feeling. And so anyone who's sitting with that, who's trying to think about that or what it means, very much, Ladarius, when you said that your doctor was gay, there are allies out there.
Yes.
And they are there for you. There are communities that are waiting to embrace you. There are people who are willing to support you, and there are people who will guide you. And truthfully, and as in anything, you always trust your gut and always be careful, but there are always going to be good people out there who are waiting for you. And it's one hell of a step to take, but once you take it, you don't even know the beautiful life that is waiting for you. And
So
that's why,
true.
beyond the rainbow, once you kind of get over there, and, it's kind of, I wanted to kind of touch on that too, because I know there's just so many aspects of it that I remember when I was sitting there, and my person was Ina Garten, the Barefoot Contessa on Food Network, because I would come home from school, and for a half an hour a day, I would just watch her with all these fabulous gay men, and she's cooking up a storm. They're having these cocktails and dinner parties. I was 14, and I was like, where the fuck is this place, and how do I get there? And I just remember, I was like, I just need to get there. It was the Hamptons. I know. Yeah, did a little research. I was like, oh, okay. But it was
One day.
yeah. But it was just that escape. And I'll kind of go into mine. I grew up in Northwest Ohio. It was very rural, very Catholic. So again, there's a religious undertone to that. But my town was very small. We weren't even considered a town. It was a village. So when I graduated with 33 students in my class, and I spent K through 12 with the same 33 students.
Wow.
We never had like middle school where you'd split up or you'd go there. You would have different classes, but we never had that kind of I like when people talked about graduating with thousands of students in their class, I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what that was like because not only did I know my fellow peers, but I knew their parents and their dogs' names. And I've probably been to all of their houses. And I mean, you just it in one sense that's great because it did. I mean, when something happened, I remember one of my classmates, his mother unfortunately passed away in a car accident. And I've never seen a community, even at a young age, come together like that. And I mean, the support was, I mean, it was, you couldn't even parlay what that means. But then, and the double edged sword of it, on the other side of it, being somebody who is different or somebody who is struggling or somebody who has those inward feelings that they're too afraid to express, you're so worried about those people because it's a small town and small towns do talk very quickly. I
Mhm.
also happen to work in the diner of the town. So on Sundays after church would get out was our busiest times. And I'm not kidding when I say, and I mean, it was the ladies particularly who were sitting. Did you see her hair today?
Mhm.
Do you know what that
Mhm.
person or I mean, it was always comments that were just so, and I never understood it because I did listen. I was intrigued by the word of God. I was brought up to listen to it. And there was one time we had to go to church like every Friday, like the first of the month or something. And I think it was in the third grade. And my mom got a phone call because um, I was sitting around a group of like kids or guys or whatever, and one of them let out some gas, and I was so infatuated on what the priest was saying that I didn't even notice, while all the other kids were,
Mm.
snickering and like whatever,
Mhm.
and she just thought that was so great. But I was listening, I was looking for even at a young age just for somebody or something that was guidance, and that was just how you were brought up. I mean, the guy in the big purple robe, he knows what's right and he's speaking directly from God.
Mhm.
So when you started to have, or when I started to have those feelings, and I'm saying we because I know we all
Mhm.
had them,
Absolutely.
you get to this place where you just feel so unbelievably lost.
Mm.
My first sexual experience was 13 with another guy. And I just remember being like, what just happened? I mean, he was my age. It wasn't a situation where it was an older person or an adult, but it still was confusing. And I was like, what just happened? What does this mean? I've always been intuitive or inquisitive too. So I just, you always have those thoughts. And then it continued. It almost borderline continued into a relationship. This guy and I actually remember prom broke my heart because we both went with girls because
Mm.
that was what was expected.
Mhm.
And but we're looking at each other on the dance
Oh,
floor.
wow.
And it had, and it was just that like what does it mean? Like
Mm.
how can something be so beautiful? How can I be having these feelings but they're so wrong? And in whose eyes?
Mm.
And who is saying that it's wrong? And it stuck with me very, very hard. And then when that one didn't work out, there was another gentleman, and he was a little bit older than I was. This was, I think, I was 17, so he was in college, and we worked together at a university for the summer. And he and I just became very, very close, like very close. He had a girlfriend, but we had an emotional connection. We had I mean, it turned into a physical one eventually, but we just had this really wonderful feeling. Just I loved being around him.
Mm.
And that age, you're always kind of trying to figure out your next steps. Adulthood's right around the corner. What does that mean for you? And I really looked up to him. And he was physically very fit. He was a bodybuilder, or he was getting into it, and he was an exercise person. So he was just very chiseled. I mean, he was a Greek god. I'm not gonna
Mm.
lie.
Mm.
So looked up to him for all of these reasons. And it was just funny because, well, I shouldn't say that it was funny, but I kept going back in my head when I was trying to figure out what it meant to those puberty videos that they showed. I don't like it for me. It was in the fifth grade. They put the girls in one room, the guys in the other
Mhm.
room. They showed you these awful videos. And I mean, and I remember watching it, and straight up, the announcer or the host said, for the gentlemen that, at some point you're going to look at girls differently. Like they're not going to be the stinky girls on the playground. You're going to want to do more things with them. And I thought, oh, good.
Finally.
Even in like the fifth grade, I was like, oh, good. And I'm still waiting
Yeah.
for it. I mean, it never happened.
No.
So it just never got there.
Well, and it was funny for me that we got those videos too, but the videos were, I think I was probably in late junior high. the videos were shown by our physical education teachers,
Yes. Yeah.
and our physical education teacher is standing there wearing these short shorts, this
Right.
very attractive, physically fit male
Yeah.
with
Yes.
his leg up on a chair
Yeah.
showing us these videos, and I'm like, I don't think I'm ever gonna feel that way that I'm supposed to feel.
I know. And they tell you, and you're like, okay, 'cause, I mean, you're gullible at that age. You're looking
Mm.
like, oh, okay. And yeah, it never happened. And then I ended up, that gentleman that I was speaking of, he ended up, there was one, like when the summer was coming to a close, I was like, I'm not going to see him because he's going to go back to school. And I was devastated.
Oh, I
And
bet.
I had no one that I could talk to about it.
Mhm.
And I know, Mom, you're listening. It's not against you because she would take that offensively. But, it wasn't that I couldn't talk to my parents. I wasn't out yet.
Yeah.
And I was still trying to figure out what that meant. And I couldn't go to any of my friends because that would out me. And it's a very small town.
Mhm.
So even in that sense, one person just says something, and I have a great support system, even back people that I went to high school with. So it wasn't that I didn't feel safe. It was that I wasn't ready. And I even got to the point where I developed an eating disorder over it because I had no control over what was going on and it just felt good. And I think there was an association with his physical attractiveness, and there was a little underlining because I was like, well, what would be wrong with me? Why would he want to be with me? And the only thing I could think of, because we had such great connections on every other level, I was like, oh, it's because he's a bodybuilder, or, he's going for these things. So in your mind, you do create these scenarios for
Absolutely.
yourself, and you do think, well, that's what it has to be. Well, the reality, Brad, was that he just wasn't gay. I mean, he may have had some gay experiences, he just wasn't gay. And that wasn't on me. But as a kid, you don't know that.
Sure.
So when we do talk about the dangers of what can happen to people when they are in this struggle, when they're in this hold, I've talked about it on this podcast before. Your inner voice is so important. The way that you talk
Mm.
to yourself, the way that you treat yourself, the things that you say, how you go about your day, you have to be careful with them, because if you are fighting against yourself, the whole world's going to be fighting against you, and you're really not going to be helping anything.
So true.
I
And
mean, to kind of piggyback off of something that you mentioned earlier about growing up in a small town, this past weekend was my 25th class reunion. And our high school, well, our school is basically the same. These same people that I saw this past weekend, I grew up with them. We were in kindergarten together. We went to middle school together, high school. It was all together. And I still had anxiety, even though, I moved to Clearwater 22 years ago. After I got over here, I came out. And I didn't necessarily share that with everybody
Mm.
back home, but MySpace, Facebook,
yeah,
they learned, and I was like, I don't really feel as though I need to come out to everybody, but
Mhm.
if you see it, I'm not hiding anything. Be times I go back home and someone be like, "Hey, I heard you came out." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm happy." And they'd be
yeah,
like, "Oh, okay." But I still had anxiety going back this
hmm,
weekend, even though all of them
Sure.
know. Yeah, and I took a date with me.
hmm,
So I'm like, I'm gonna walk in with this boy and everybody's gonna stare at me. And I walk in and everyone's like, "Hey, you're good." And they're running up to my date and talking about how we grew up and things like that, telling stories. No issues.
hmm.
But I still had that, like, I'm driving
Mhm.
down and I'm like, the anxiety, the heart pounding.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
Are
oh
they
yeah.
gonna be cool? You know?
I recently had to go back for a funeral to Ohio, and being in the cemetery, the church was very big. That was, I mean, there were so many memories I had there, but the town and just faces that you recognize, that it's like, and it's the Facebook effect where you're like, everybody sees everything on Facebook, even when you don't think that they are. So it's like, I know they've probably seen, because I was engaged at one point. I mean, I can't really hide it beyond there, but I've never been one that has hidden, especially
Right.
after I did come out of the closet. And when I did move, and you brought up when you moved to Clearwater, you felt a different way. When I moved to Tampa, went to the University of Tampa, it was a whole different world.
Mm.
I mean, it was just all of a sudden, it was not only is it something that's accepted, it's celebrated. I
Mhm.
mean, there were parades, and there
Mhm.
were, I mean, Ybor, gosh, in
And
2010 was a lot of
there's
fun.
even
Like,
a
I mean,
difference
you would
between
go,
the Tampa gay community and the Pinellas County Hillsborough gay
yeah,
community, Pinellas County gay community.
right,
Even seeing that, and so you were at the University of Tampa.
yeah,
I
right,
can only imagine what you were exposed to. I was just a little Dunedin.
yeah, right.
It was the Dunedin gays.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I always said, going to it was like Subway. You could have it your way.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, you could. It really was. It was a good time, but it was just a whole new. And even, taking the sex out of it, even just like walking down the street holding hands with somebody, that
Mm.
was, it was, oh, and you're seeing, you would go meet people, and then they would know somebody who had a house, and you go to a gay dinner party, and all of a sudden I was going to my INA days, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, this actually is happening. Like, it was so
Mhm.
cool. And and again, I'm kind of bringing that back because I really do want to emphasize for people that are struggling, like, especially in those small towns, like, and I'm never gonna, I would never say get away, but I do think exposing yourself to new
Mhm.
experiences,
Right.
new areas, and you really have to be kind of mindful of where you're going and
Definitely.
who's, and just be very wise about it before you make
Mhm.
any big decisions. But I do think that it will give you something that can help you in the long run.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I'd like to go back on your comments on, listening to that inner voice.
Hmm.
I mean, what is your inner voice, right?
Right.
What is it? It's you. Sometimes your conversation between you and higher power, or you and God, or
Right.
something bigger than yourself. But it's so important to be honest with that voice.
Right. Right.
It's so important. Once I got honest with that voice inside my head, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I went from being at war with myself to at complete peace with myself.
Right. Right. It's hard to do. It's
It's
very, very
extremely, I
difficult
mean,
to
like,
do.
it took me years, literally years. And
Hmm.
Ladarius, back to what you were talking about, your reconciliation between you and God seemed to come pretty easily for you. That was not my
I can
story.
understand.
That was not my story. It took, again, years to reconcile that piece for me. And I had to do a lot of research and a lot of
Mhm.
digging. And okay, we're putting all of this weight into this book. Where did this book come from?
Right.
Who wrote this book?
Right.
Didn't just fall out of the sky. So I went back to, the 1500s and Constantine and how all of the books were put together. There were hundreds of other books at that time. This group of men just decided that these were the
Right.
ones, these group of humans
Right.
decided that these were the books that were going to be assembled. And this is what we're putting our entire lives into
Well, and
this
it
book.
transcended. I mean, it went for centuries. Like, that is
Yeah.
where it's.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, like I said, my parents did allow my brother and I to experience other religions. So
Mhm.
even though Hardy County, where I'm from, is very rural, there are different churches. There's a Methodist church, there's a Catholic church, and then, you have the missionary Baptist churches that are there. And what is taught in all of these churches, and I learned, this is kind of like my eyes open, is there's a general idea of you should be a good person.
Mm.
But there's certain rules that start happening in different churches. And one of the things were the way that women were expected to respond.
Mm.
So, like in our church, man, head of the house,
Mhm.
that's how it's supposed to be. And then I go over to this other church that is Methodist, and there is a woman who's preaching,
Mhm.
because that would have never happened in our
Right.
Right.
church.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, so if you can do that, so that made me think, all right, there if being gay is one of those things
Mhm.
that maybe it's just not accepted here, but there's somebody within religious groups that's going to say to me what you're doing is okay
Yeah.
based upon
That
what they're
is true,
right,
right? And then who's to say what is the right way?
right.
And that's where the struggle constantly is. And that's where people are going to bring up. Obviously, religion has a lot of emotion to it. There's
Mm.
no way that you are going to say that you are 100% open to or throwing yourself into a religion without saying that there is some sort of an emotional connection that's
Mhm.
binding you to that.
Right.
Whether it's a time of comfort, whether it's just because it's nostalgic or that's how you were raised, there's always going to be. And you have to kind of go beyond that. I think you have to look at it beyond what let me rephrase that. You would recognize what the emotional connection is, but then go beyond that to think logically, what does that mean for me? And it's
Mhm.
100% okay. I mean, it's great to have a spiritual life and know what a religious life, whatever that
Right.
means to you.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
talk about it in mental health all the time, especially because a lot of times people deal with what happens to me, what happens to my soul, whatever you
Mhm.
believe in when we're not here. And that also brings us comfort, which is also an emotional connection. So there's always some sort of underlying, but I think with what you're saying too, Ladarius, and both of us, just it's the way that you treat people now. I can only imagine logically that that would have more to do with what happens after. And even if it doesn't, it has more to do with what you can do now and how you can make that going forward, making the communities, the world that we live in, a better place.
Mhm.
And I knew religion was going to pop up. Obviously, we knew this was going to
Obviously, we
happen.
knew
I mean,
yeah.
and I think most listeners who are also gay individuals would agree. There probably is some sort of religious guilt or some sort
Yeah.
of shame around that, because that's bound to happen. But I do want us to also focus on the positives of everything, and that's why this was
Mm.
titled, being out and proud beyond the
Mhm.
rainbow.
Mhm.
Now that we kind of have some of our our backgrounds and our stories and our experiences, I mean, I really wanted to go into, LD, your time as Jayden,
Okay.
and because Jayden is fabulous. I mean, and I think I really do want to talk about this, because I'm thinking there could be some straight couple who might be listening to this who might not even know what drag is.
Right.
So could you elaborate a little bit? And
Absolutely, absolutely. So, the art of drag is just that. It's an art form.
yes,
Just as you have musicians, you have singers, you have people who, which we're learning now, as it becomes a little more open to everybody. Because usually, like drag had to be a man impersonating a woman. No,
right.
drag is anybody who wants to put on another alter ego and to entertain someone.
Yes,
And
right.
it's all about entertainment. I mean, there's more that comes along with it. After you entertain, there's a community. I mean, and I guess that's kind of where it kind of started also is it was a form of entertainment, but it was also a form to protect our community,
Hmm.
to raise, to look out for the community. I mean, we talk about the
Hmm.
the gay rights movement. A lot of that happened with drag queens starting out in New York City. You can get, I mean,
Right.
we can all
There's
do
a
that.
whole
We can, all,
history
yeah. There's
there.
a whole
Yeah.
history there. We can go into the research, but for me, I oddly enough, I started out drag actually in my hometown. I'm gonna say how this works. So in Hardy County, we used to have a lot of different uh, fundraising activities for the senior class. And our senior class, because we had a lot of tragedies of kids graduating high school, going out that night getting drunk, and someone would obviously would unfortunately pass away, car accidents, things like that.
Mm.
So they created this thing called Project Graduation back in, like, I think it was like 1993 or 94, where they would have all of these fundraising activities to raise money, and then they'd have a big graduation party that was a lock-in at the Civic Center. And they'd raise money and there'd be prizes. They gave away a car every year. Like, it was like big.
Wow.
Wow.
It's a lot of money in Hardy County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do a lot of things back there. But one of the fundraisers, they thought it was funny to have a drag pageant where all of the guys who were seniors would dress up as women and have a pageant. Now,
Nice.
they were making fun.
Right.
They thought it was a hilarious thing. But whenever they first started, me, kind of not knowing myself, but
Yeah.
kind of knowing myself, I was like, man, I can't wait till I become a senior. But then when I became a senior, I was like afraid. I'm
Mm.
like, oh, if I do this and I do this well, it's gonna be problematic. And don't get me wrong, I mean, from a young age, I would dress up in my mom's shoes. It's just a very sweet thing that I had a lot of people probably didn't know growing up is, my mother had these two pair of there's a navy blue pair and a burgundy pair of like size 9 pumps. She never wore them. And I remember I would sneak into her closet and I'd put them on and I'd walk around and I'd get my walk together. I'd hear her outside when she's coming home because, we'd be home from school earlier, latchkey kids, whatever. She'd get home, I'd rush in, I'd put the shoes back in there. It took me years before I realized Mom didn't get rid of those shoes because she wasn't wearing them. She knew I was wearing them.
Aw.
It was my outlet. And
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious and
I
great.
wanted to have that conversation with her so many times before she passed away about 5 years ago, but I never did. But
Mm.
I do know because there is no other logical reason for those shoes to stick around as long as they did.
Right.
Until probably my foot, I grew them and then they
Yeah.
were gone. Because we're grown boys. I could wear a size 9 when I was about 14. But anyways, they had this pageant for these guys, and I'm a senior. I was student council vice president. I mean, all of these activities. So it was expected you're a popular guy, you have
Yeah.
to be in this pageant. Because I wasn't gonna do it. I was excited about it, but then as you get older, you
Yeah.
start thinking,
That
"Oh my god, they're
anxiety,
gonna
yeah.
know." So
Yeah.
you're not gonna do it, but, it was like, "Oh, no, well, it's a given, you have to do it," you know? And one of my friends, I convinced him to do it with us, so we do this drag pageant, and, my 2 Jasons, they're 2 of my closest friends named Jason, um, both were athletes. One was a swimmer, one was a runner. They both do it as well. There was about 25 of us. Well, I won.
Oh my gosh,
I
that's
literally won the
great.
crown, and I had my 2 Jasons that followed up. So it was basically, and my name wasn't Jayden the first time around. It was
Mhm.
Shaquanda. Uh, I don't know why Shaquanda, but
Yeah.
Shaquanda won the crown, and I had my Jasons as my background. Sasha, and I can't remember what the other Bambi, I think. Sasha and Bambi. But that was my first time doing it, and
Mm.
I was told my dad. My dad didn't think anything of it
Mhm.
because it was a joke.
Right.
Yeah.
Mom, she's like, "Oh yeah, go get whatever you need." I borrowed a dress from one of the girls down the street who was also a hefty girl because I was hefty. Um, and I won this thing, and then I moved here, and this is probably about 3 years later. I moved here, and Melanie Mignon um, saw me doing a show. So one of my other friends entered into the Miss Mardi Gras pageant. And
Mm.
back then, Miss Mardi Gras was just a bunch of locals just doing a drag
Mm.
pageant, raising money for Mardi Gras, um, fundraising and things like that. And it was like a lot of locals before like actual professional drag queens started being in it.
Right.
But I was just this background dancer. And I'm background there doing my thing. And Melanie saw me and she says, "You need to come do a show with me."
Aw.
And I was like, "Oh, girl, I'm not a drag queen." And she's like, "No, just come do a show with me." And I went and I bought a cross dress for less, which is Ross. Went and got me a good old dress from Ross. It was booger drag at best. I know I looked a hot mess. I don't think that wig fit right. But I do this show with her, and I I became a different person.
Mm.
Mhm.
Jayden was born.
Right. Right.
And Jaden's out here performing. People are smiling. People giving you money.
Yeah.
Mm.
I will say that being a drag queen is probably one of the most lucrative jobs I've ever made, or ever had. Where else can you go and make $300 for 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, right.
seriously.
Right. Right.
Um, but I saw the joy that was there. Not just how I felt,
Right.
but how people responded to
Mm.
it.
I think there's an overall, I've seen this at many, many drag shows, and, like, even as a gay man, sometimes I was like, "Oh, please don't bring me up on stage, don't, I'm just like, oh, here we go." But you always kinda if you ever, like, scope out the crowd, there's always, like, that moment at first, and I'm sure as a performer,
Hmm.
where people are maybe a little, like, tight, like, their shoulders are a little hunched, or they're kinda, like, looking around, and then eventually they're like, "Oh," it becomes a safe space
Yes.
very quickly.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you look around. I mean, even just this past, we met up at
Hmm.
Drag Queen Brunch, excuse me, at Blur that they
Hmm.
do every month, and it was a good place for us to talk about
Yeah.
the this episode. And just even you see it, and all of a
Hmm.
sudden, I mean, there's a drag queen out in the middle of the street that's hopping on a golf cart,
Mhm.
and
It's
and
a
people
beautiful
are, I
thing.
know it really was very smart, very well done. But it was just, and it brings, and then you see other people on the
Yeah.
outside of the community who are like, well, what's going on here?
Hmm.
And just going back to like the history of drag, and just so much of what it does do for a community.
Correct.
And if you've ever been like, oh God, I would never go to a drag show, go. I
Hmm.
mean, I
Yeah.
guarantee you're gonna have a good time.
You're
I
Mhm.
gonna you're gonna have a good time. It's all about fun. And after a while, I would do a couple of shows with Melody, and I started meeting some of the other queens. And there's joy in doing it. And then there's the kind of the come down after you get off the stage and you're back in your normal t-shirt and jeans, and you know you're tired, but you're also a little bit sad
oh,
because the
I
show's
could see
over.
that.
The
Yeah.
show's
Yeah.
over.
Right.
I
Right.
got to peel the eyelashes
Yeah.
off. Although I remember one time my dad was staying with me for a weekend because we had a family funeral or something like that. But he was staying with me, and I had a show scheduled that night. And so I get him all situated in my apartment, and I was like, I got to go to work. I'll be right back. Now, the job that I did in healthcare at the time did call for me to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So he was thinking I was going to this job,
Yeah.
but no, I was actually going to a drag show. Got there as quickly as I could, beat the face really quickly, get on stage, do the show, and I get off stage and they're like, "Are you staying?" I was like, "No, I got to go back home." So I get home, my dad's asleep, everything's fine. Wake up the next morning, we're having breakfast, and I was like, "Okay, we're gonna get our day started." I'm sitting at breakfast with him, and I get up and I go in the bathroom. I still have lashes on. There's no makeup, but I still have lashes on. And I sat in front of him at breakfast with
Whoops.
full lashes on. He never said anything, he was just probably sitting there. But there was the come down from it.
Right.
When you get off stage and now it's like, okay, well, I have to go back to life as normal. And then you're just ready for the next time. It is
Yeah.
expensive. It's
Oh,
very
yeah.
expensive.
But I want to point that out. If you think being a drag queen is not hard,
Oh
I
my God.
dare you.
Oh my God.
I
Oh my
dare
God.
you.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're not comfortable with it, at the very least, have some respect for it because my God,
Right. Yeah.
like it's
It's a
not
lot of
something.
preparation.
Mhm.
There's rehearsing. As I said, it is an art form, just like any artist. You have to practice your art. You got to prepare for your art.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna have to practice. You're gonna have to stand in front of a mirror in your
Mm.
living room and rehearse your routines, and you have to make sure the outfits fit before you put them on before you get out there.
Yeah.
Right.
But the other aspect of being a drag queen was becoming a part of the community
Mm-hmm.
and meeting with your drag sisters and things like this. And this was something that you and I spoke about this weekend. Is you put on this persona to make money, to make people happy, um, but there's also the persona that in your personal life there's certain things that you probably still use that mask for,
Mm.
so
Mm-hmm.
that people don't see what you're really struggling with.
Right.
Mm.
You know.
Right. And a lot of members of the LGBTQ plus community do that in the same way. I mean,
Hmm.
to kind of put that in the same trajectory. I mean, suicide is huge in our community, unfortunately, especially with youth, especially with trans youth. I don't remember the specific statistics on it, but I think trans youth is probably one of the highest categories that you're ever going to find that with. And
Mm.
we use a mask for many many things throughout our day-to-day life, and especially when you're struggling, and that all stems from shame and guilt, and that's the first, and that's why that's such a heavy topic with what we're all talking about, and that's why we're sharing our stories.
Mhm.
But you're absolutely right, and I know you've dealt with probably more than I can contest to, because you were talking about your time as being out now versus being out.
Oh yeah.
You said, I think, what year, or do you know a year when you?
Oh yeah, I came. I think it was 2001.
Okay.
When yeah, it was 2001 when I came out. I think it was about around April of 2001 when I came out.
Hmm.
And when I came out and I came to Dunedin, um, the the community within Dunedin definitely embraced me. Um, but still back home, it was so many people that I wouldn't want to tell. But
Hmm.
I'm like, I'm out now, so what do you do?
Hmm.
But being out then, there were still places you wouldn't want to go.
Hmm.
There were bars you don't want to go to, if you're, especially if you're, especially if you're gonna be gay.
Yeah. Right. Right. I think. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
okay, so we're going to this restaurant that's predominantly straight, so I need you to tone it down. And I had
Yes.
friends who would
Yeah.
say that to me,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I'm like, what do you mean tone it down? I'm like, I'm not gonna walk in there and like embarrass you. Like, what do
Right.
you
Right.
expect me to do? Like to, and they're like, well, I'm just saying because I don't want to cause any issues, and I'm like,
You're
okay.
causing more of an issue.
Yeah.
Right. Let me just go in there and be
Yeah.
me.
Let
It's
me
Right.
like
say
I'm not
that.
gonna do a number
Yeah.
right in the middle of the
Right.
restaurant.
Yeah.
I do not
Yeah.
have a boa in my
Right.
bag that I'm
Yeah.
just gonna, pull out of that in a wig and,
Yeah.
although I can do quick drag. Don't get me wrong. If you need me to do it,
Jaden's always
right?
ready.
If
Yeah.
Jaden's always
Quick
ready if you
drag.
need me to do it. But yeah, so it was still you had your safe spaces that you would go
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
and also back then, and it's still there, but a lot of I don't know why people thought it went away, but HIV and AIDS
Hmm.
Mhm.
was a big thing, and I had
Mhm.
friends who we were losing,
Right. Right.
at that time.
Right.
That system and the way that healthcare has changed for individuals, unfortunately, who may have contracted, it is definitely a lot different now than it used to be,
Yes.
and so again, even with that, you would sense some of the struggles of the
Mhm.
people in the community,
Right.
back
And then
then.
that brings that mask back out.
Right. But then as years, like I was telling you, Bradley, I'm in such that weird space of an age that we I remember
Mhm.
uh, the way that uh, you weren't supposed to talk about it.
Mhm.
You weren't supposed to talk about HIV and AIDS and things like that. I had an aunt who contracted HIV and AIDS, but when I was in high school, oddly enough, we were progressive even though we were rural. I learned a lot
Mm,
about the disease and complications of it and things like that, and I wasn't afraid.
mm.
I wasn't afraid to interact. I wasn't afraid to hug. I wasn't afraid because I'm like,
Mhm.
this is not how
Right.
you contract it.
Right.
Right.
You
Yeah.
shouldn't
Right.
be worried about all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Right.
And I did a lot of education with my family members. I
Mhm.
remember walking up to my aunt and giving her a big hug, and my dad standing back here looking like, oh, I don't know if you should have did that.
Right.
My mother was a nurse. She was
Mm.
fine.
Right.
My
Right.
brother wouldn't go anywhere near her.
Right.
And I have, and I'm looking at y'all and I'm like,
Right.
y'all need to love up on this lady right now
Yeah.
Yeah.
because do you realize what she's
Yeah.
going through?
Yeah.
Right.
Same with the community. Can y'all love up on these people?
Yeah.
Right.
Like, come on.
Yeah.
We got to.
Yeah.
But then time passes, things progress, and so now I'm happy to see it. Don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
I know
I
what you're
am not
saying.
complaining, because I think with some of the technology innovations that have happened in healthcare and individuals who are undetectable now.
Mhm.
I remember the first time somebody said, "Hey, I'm undetectable," and they were celebrating, it, and I was like, "Oh my God, that is amazing!"
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I'm just like happy for you, but at the same time, I'm like, man,
Yeah.
Yeah.
God, I have some friends that I just wish,
Wish.
Mhm.
Yeah.
God, I wish they would have had this opportunity,
Yeah.
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
But
Right.
yeah, so it's like it's that whole 20-year period.
Yeah. It's quite the
Mhm.
shift. I mean,
Yeah.
Mhm.
we're in a new age of. Uh, well, and this is. I was talking when actually that funeral. I was talking to one of my younger cousins, and it's cool to be gay now. And I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's one
Mm.
of those like almost like a rite of passage where it's like, oh, I've had a girlfriend or I've had a boyfriend or
Right.
whatever it is. And I mean, and it is, it's almost that bittersweetness to it of, well, that's great, but also like, wow,
Yeah.
it's hard to wrap your head around it a little bit. But I mean, we want the younger generations to do well. We want them to have a better life than what we did. I just hope that they do appreciate that as they go
Well,
forward.
I
It
think
doesn't mean they don't have their struggles, but I
Right.
mean, there's
I
just,
don't think they can though, just like we can't imagine like literally having to be closeted. Like
yeah,
I can't
yeah.
I can't wrap my head around that, but that wasn't that long ago.
Right.
it was not.
And if I might share one more story, because I know you asked me about coming out, and I'm not sure that I hit that on the head. I told you a
Oh,
little bit about my story, but
yeah.
when I actually came out to my parents, they were not real pleased.
Mhm.
My mom holed up in her room for like 3 days, didn't come out. My
Wow.
my dad did actually. He stood up, he hugged me and said, "I don't understand it, but I love you." And then said, "Can't you just sleep in separate bedrooms like your mother and I do?" I was like, "Dad, I'm 30. Like, no, no, I cannot."
Now,
Um,
when your father said that, you didn't look him some kind of way and be like, "No, are you trying to say something?"
I know.
Just asking. I mean,
Exactly. But at that time, I was very close, not in a sexual relationship, but with my pastor's wife. And I had shared with her. And she looked at me and said, "If you, quote, do this, meaning come out and leave your husband or whatever," she said, "I will do everything in my power to separate you from your children."
Wow.
Now, that frightened me.
Mhm.
It's a big church with a lot of money. But then I, simmered on that for little bit, and I was like, "Well, she really can't do anything legally, at that point." And so I kind of blew it off after that, but I thought, "Okay, this relationship is over. We are not friends anymore." And,
Right. Yeah.
so fast forward, so that was, gosh, we'll just say 15 years ago. Recently, I've been in contact with a couple other friends who went to the same church who also came out, but they came out 30 years ago.
Mhm.
One of them, this is the same church, one of them had 3 kids at the time, and the church hired an attorney and did get her kids removed from
Wow.
her. So that was 30 years ago.
Wow. Wow.
and mine was 15 years ago, and now here we are today. So
Right.
even in that time frame, that's not that long
Yeah, it's
ago.
not. No,
And
no.
it's I think fear. I mean, fear is such a big thing on the acceptance of others.
Mhm. Mhm.
They're
Very true.
afraid
Right.
of what's gonna happen. Can't we just like your your dad said to you, well,
Yeah.
can't y'all just sleep in separate rooms?
Right.
Right.
Like, why do you have to change the system to do
Yeah.
this? Just continue to do what you do, but don't tell anyone,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
I remember my dad saying something to me like this. No, actually, one of my roommates said it to me whenever because I'd lived with two straight guys when I first came out.
Mhm.
I had to sit down and have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
And even though they'd been friends, one of them, we'd been friends, well, actually, both of them, I've known them my entire life. They moved here with me. And they were both accepting. I just had one friend said, so does this mean I'm going to wake up at like 3 a.m. and there's going to be a half
Right.
naked man eating a bologna sandwich in the
Right.
refrigerator? I mean, in the living room kitchen? And I was like, no, you will not find a half naked man at 3 a.m. eating a bologna
Right.
sandwich. I don't eat bologna. It'll probably be ham or turkey.
I was just gonna say. I was like, yeah, like he'd still be in the room.
Like you're still,
Yeah, he,
but it was the fear that things are going to change. The
right,
comfort level that you have is going to go away, and now I have to learn something new.
right. That's
You
exactly
know.
it. It is, and you get it even further in that fear factor. It's like, well, what is that really stemming from? And I think if we all combined our experiences, we'd be able to say very confidently that a lot of people who do have issues with gay people have had a lot of thoughts or experiences of
Hmm.
their own that
Hmm.
they're too afraid to face.
Right.
And I will say this in a somewhat joking manner. I used to live right next to International Airport, which means that my apartment was very close to a hotel. And on Grinder, I just want to say
Oh yeah.
that most of those businessmen are also on Grinder. If you have to look up what Grinder is, I apologize. Maybe check in with your husband. But there are a lot of people out there who do live these secret lives. And I
Mhm.
always wonder when somebody comes from a place of so much hate, and I'm very fortunate. My brother and my father are both extremely supportive. I mean, just my rocks, when it comes to so many things, but also just with being straight men who are comfortable with who they are and not having an issue with it. I bring,
Mm.
I've brought home boyfriends. I've been
Mhm.
able to kiss my boyfriends around them. I've been able to go on trips with them, and like there's just no issues. And really, you think, well, what is the big deal about it? I mean, sometimes like kissing is just gross between anybody.
Mm.
Like,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Right.
Sometimes we just don't want to
I don't
see it
want
no
to see it.
matter
I don't
who
want
it
to see it
is.
bleed.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, and I just think that's an important note. So before we kind of wrap some things up, I just wanted to ask each of you, because we want to end on a nice positive note here. What is your favorite part or your favorite thing about being gay?
I
Hmm.
wish you would have asked me this on Sunday, so I had some time to think about it. Hmm.
Here, I'm gonna go if you don't mind. I grew up with a pretty privileged white life, and when I came out, I quickly became in the somewhat marginalized category. Without that, I don't think I would have the empathy that I have for anyone in a marginalized community, whether it be gay or people of color. I wouldn't have that experience. So I am extremely grateful to have that.
That's it. Yeah. I think for me, it's probably uh, freedom.
Mm,
Mm,
And it's going to
mhm.
sound weird when I say that to some of our listeners. It's like, you're gay. How are you free? Um, I've in my lifetime watched a lot of people who were either, from a religious perspective, also being straight, being just not being able to live their authentic
Mm,
self.
mhm.
mhm.
And I had that
Boom.
opportunity, and I can my and I have also the freedom to understand that my authentic self changes,
Mhm.
Mhm.
sometimes daily, sometimes yearly. I'm not the same person I was when, I first came out when I was 21. I've evolved, I've grown, I learn every day. Um, and I have that freedom to move into those directions without thinking, well, if I if I want to do this, I'm going to have judgment
Mm-hmm.
because I've been judged my
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
entire life.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of get that freedom of, well, I don't really care what you think of me.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I'm still going to do this, but still having um, the respect to not harm.
Mm.
And I think that's a big thing
Right.
for me is I want to have freedom, but I don't want to harm anybody.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not going to go out and do anything that's going to cause anybody any problems, but I still want to be able to move and flow wherever, the universe leads me to go.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I second all of that.
I have to say it's the relationships because
Mm.
I mean, I'm naturally drawn towards lesbians. So, I mean, let's be honest. I have so many lesbian friends that have just completely helped me through some awful times in
Mhm.
life. And, and the gay men that I have met, who there was one trip, actually being from a small high school, I think there were like 4 of us that got together and we went to Pensacola Pride. I mean, we flew in from all over the country and we were just there just because we had that connection, that bond, not only just from being gay, but also from our experience going to the same high school that was very similar. So we all had that weekend just to be free, to be ourselves, and the just all of them. I mean, there is kind of once you find like we've said, once you
Mhm.
find that community of people,
Mhm.
it really truly is one of the biggest blessings I think you could
Mhm.
probably ever get from life.
Yeah.
And that's ironic because we've talked so much about religion. But on top of that, with
I mean, as
with
you said, it so becomes those relationships and this is kind of transcending back to that decade-long time frame. It became your new family. For a lot
exactly
of people, it did
right,
become your new family.
right,
When your
right.
family leaves you, it's your new family. But those relationships,
And they do,
absolutely
and they
important.
carry you through. And I do want to reiterate that again to anybody who is struggling. There is a community that is out there. And speaking of relationships, to the two of you, thank you so much for being here today, for your bravery, for your honesty, for putting it all out there, and for
Thank you.
being
Thank
continued
you.
One thing
support
to
in our
add,
community.
just really quickly to
Yeah,
say, for those individuals out there that are looking for guidance, support, there are so many community organizations
hmm
here in Tampa. I mean, there's a lot of them. You can look them up. But if you're thinking of getting out of a small town or a situation, if you can find one of those community organizations in a bigger city or in a city close to you, to reach out to them, that's one way to start building those relationships.
exactly,
Mhm.
Yeah.
100%.
Mhm.
My name is Bradley Wank, and this has been an episode of On What Brings You In. As always, if you or anyone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, you can call or text 988 or go to 988lifeline.org. Someone will be there to help you.